Hi guys, welcome to another video. So in this video, I'm sharing with you a brand new project of mine. This is going to be a medieval, magical themed, 12th scale, scratch built dollhouse. So if that sounds like something that you could get into, please stick around and let's see how I built this thing. Today's video is in collaboration with AlgoLaser, who very kindly sent me their extension kit for me to take a look at and share with you guys today. Now, if you are regular to my channel, you may have seen that in last year, December 2024, AlgoLaser had sent me their DIY kit Mark II laser cutting machine, along with the air assist and the honeycomb base. Now that 400 by 400 millimeter square cutting space is a very nice size for anybody. However, you do have the option to upgrade and customize your AlgoLaser machines from upping your wattage for the actual laser itself, to the honeycomb, but also to the actual size of your cutting area. So on this particular machine, you can actually extend it up to 850 millimeters in length. I've been wanting to scratch build my own doll's house for quite a long time now, so when Algo reached out to me and asked me if I'd be interested in taking a look at this kit, it was a no-brainer for me. Now, if you have purchased this kit yourself, you should find inside your box the new length arms, as well as a long piece of air pipe, just in case you do happen to have the air assist, as well as the new lengths of tracks and all of your wires as well. Now, when it comes to changing over, it is very simple. All that we need to do is detach our laser, just unclipping those pins because that laser is held into place with some pins. You need to take off the homing devices, then you would unscrew the two short ends of your laser. You would then feed in the new legs or the new arms like you see me doing in just a moment. It is all very, very easy and simple stuff. I'd say changing this over took me around about 45 minutes, maybe an hour, something like that. I did spend a little bit of time having a look through the manual, which is very straightforward and easy to understand. The thing which did take the most amount of time was changing the wires that go into the computer part of this machine. So on the back of that computer, there are a lot of screws, and I don't think it actually showed this in the manual, so I kind of had to figure that out for myself, or I certainly couldn't find that in the manual. So all that you have to do if you are doing this for yourself is on the back of that computerized part, you unscrew all of those screws, and then that back plate comes off. You then unplug that wire. It is very easy to distinguish what that wire is for once you get that taken off. You then put in the new length of wire, screw your back onto the back of that computer, and then connect it to the laser module. And it really is as simple and as easy as that. So I mentioned before that I've been wanting to build my own doll's house for a while now, and it was actually in 2023 when I visited the medieval town of York, which is in Yorkshire in the UK. And as you can see, it is a beautiful, beautiful spot. So with that inspiration in mind, I went over to Lightburn and I put a few shapes together which would resemble a medieval building, and then I sent that over to the laser cutter. The laser which I received from AlgoLaser is a 10-watt laser, so the maximum thickness that can pass through with wood is 3 millimeters. So I went online and I ordered a load of this 3mm MDF. I went for the longest which I could find, which would fit in that 850 millimeters, just so that I could create the sides of this building in one pass. I decided that I wanted to keep this very simple as well, as I've never designed a doll's house from scratch before. So this is basically just a load of box shapes with a pointy roof on the top, which I do change as I progress. The whole thing of this, it was very much designing on the spot, because I found that I had this idea but that didn't quite work, so I had to change things around quite often. Now, if you're wondering what that funny little rectangular thing at the bottom is, that is actually going to be a space for a drawer. I find that having the drawers in my Greenleaf McKinley dollhouse is really handy for me to put things in as I'm changing things around, which I do tend to do sometimes. Now, for the actual floors themselves, I measured mine out to be 10 inches on the ground floor, then it goes to 9.5 inches, and then the loft space is 11 inches tall. For the floor supports, I'm using this strips of wood which I bought at B&Q, and these were just under £4, and they are 6mm by 10mm, and they come in a really long length. I can't remember what the length is exactly, but I'm just holding those down with some wood glue, and everything is very strong and supported. Now, being a medieval house, I did want to create the, I believe it's called a jetty, so where the next floor up overhangs from the floor below. It took me a little while for me to figure out exactly how I would be able to create this shape and have this as a working door. More so, it really boggled my brain on how I was going to make a hinge work with those shapes, but I figured it out in the end. Now, for the actual windows, I am using windows which I already have. This whole project, I want to do a lot of stash busting with it because I have so much stuff and it needs a place to go. A lot of these medieval buildings do have these boxed windows or bow windows, so I created a little box to go around that so that I could try and achieve that effect. I was feeling a little bit concerned at how strong this bottom half of the building would be, as it is just a, at this point, it is a single layer of 3mm wood. I do double it up shortly, but to hold everything into place, I'm using some of that same strip wood which I got from B&Q, and I'm making sure that I add plenty of glue to secure it into place. For the windows of this doll's house, I'm actually using some which I'd purchased on a eBay lot a few years ago. Now, with this style of window, it is not ideal for a medieval house. Even though I did take off the canopy, it's still not right. But at the same time, this house, though it is a medieval building, I'm not actually setting it in the Middle Ages. So hopefully we can get away with that, though I will try and make the glass look slightly more medieval along the way. Now, the beams of this structure are far too new and pristine, so we need to change that. So to make these look like old medieval beams, I'm just using my Dremel with a large sandpaper drum just to take away all of those perfect 90-degree angles. Now, this does kick off a whole load of sawdust, so if you do something like this, please make sure that you are protecting yourself with the appropriate masking eyewear. So for the bottom of the house, I do want it to have a brick effect. Now, this file, I have made this public on my Cricut design space. I'll leave the link to that in the description box below. This is the same stencil which I used for my adult themed dollhouse. Now, for me to stick this down, I use this pin flare stencil glue. It is absolutely brilliant. And then I just use my brayer just to make sure that none of my mixture, which I've made up here, gets underneath. I don't actually have a recipe for this mixture, as I kind of just pour in my ingredients and whip it up, but I basically use play sand with plaster of Paris, tile grout and some PVA glue as well. Next, I painted all of the windows in a black acrylic paint, followed with a dry brushing of grey. I went pretty heavy with the grey dry brushing because I want to give some variation in the window frame colour itself. If I was to leave it just as is, I think this would be really suitable for a haunted house or an abandoned house or something like that. However, I am going to use some walnut varnish to paint over that, and then what that does is it warms up that black and grey colour. It gives it a nice sheen and it just makes everything more cohesive. Now, to try and make these windows feel a little more in a medieval kind of theme, I'm adding this leaded glass window effect, which I have made a video showing you how you can make this yourself, and I'll leave the link in the description box below for that. It was at this stage that I realised having a triangular shaped roof was not going to be very practical, because I do plan on making this room into a wizard's library, so I did need to square off the back of this house. Next, I trimmed down this piano hinge using a jeweler's saw. I picked this hinge up at B&Q. Then I was able to hang the door, and at that point I could then figure out the shape for the front of the house to compensate for me creating that overhang. Now that I've figured out the shape of the roof and hung the door, I can start thinking about these dormer windows. Now, I actually picked these up on eBay a couple of years ago, and I've just been waiting for the right opportunity or the right project for me to use them. Next, I headed over to Spellbound Miniatures and I purchased the shingle bundle. You get 5 different types of shingles in that bundle. It is very cool. I cut this out using the laser cutter and I used Cricut craft board for that. Now that my shingles are in place, I decided to add some wood trim across the top of the roof, and I'm using another piano hinge for this roof to be able to open. Now, I did need to add some balsa wood to the front of these windows as well, because the thickness of the Cricut craft board did come up to line with where the original roof was, so I added that just to bring it out a little bit. I do need to still add the top part of the roof here and the leading around the underneath of the window, and I went ahead and painted those top windows as well. Now, I did off camera go ahead and make these 3 drawers, and I also off camera cut down to size this 9mm MDF as my base. For the drawer front itself, I have this offcut of MDF, which is the perfect length for the drawer. However, it isn't quite high enough. So I'm using some of the wooden dowels that I created the beams with, and these are the perfect width for this drawer. So when I add one on the either side, it then gives me the perfect height for this drawer. I then went to B&Q and I purchased this trim so that I could decorate the front of the drawer and make it look a little bit nicer, and then I filled in all of my gaps with some wood filler. To glue it into place, I put a very heavy coat of Gorilla wood glue and then just shifted that drawer onto it and then left it alone for a few hours to dry. The reason for me having the 3 storage drawers is I needed to add some wood in between those sections just so that it held some of the weight of the house. Next, I added these 4 decorative corner feet which I purchased on Amazon, and the main structure is now complete. I then went back to the laser cutter and I cut out these small crazy paving kind of shape. To make it easy application, I used a sticky jewel picky tool and I glued those down with wood glue. I then coated everything in a mixture of black paint and Mod Podge. I then gave the same treatment to the bricks on both sides, well, all 3 sides of the house. Whilst that was drying, I mixed up some watered down creamy magnolia kind of coloured paint. I could have, to be honest, left it this natural colour. However, I do want it to have more, well, just more warmth to it, I guess. So I coated everything with that, and then I mixed up some brown paint with some water to paint in my beams. Now I'm doing this in layers. I think in total I did 3 layers, but the reason for that is because I wanted the wood, instead of just looking like it was sticking paint, to have a little bit more depth. Now this is a medieval building after all, so we do not want it looking like it has had a fancy paint job. So I went in with some, I believe it was raw umber mixed with some isopropyl alcohol. I then gave this wash all over the plastered areas. I went from side to side to side, letting each one dry in between, and then I would go back and then build up that layer for a second time. Once that second layer had dried, I went in with, I think it was burnt sienna, and with a little bit of raw umber, and I started to add it around the edges just to create where the dirt and grime would naturally accumulate on something like this. For the brickwork, I wanted to have something kind of dark feeling but warm at the same time. So instead of painting all of my bricks individually, I just had a few different colours of brown on my palette. So I had the ochres, the umbers and so on, and then I just brushed them on in a pretty random fashion around the walls, not really thinking too much about it. And then I took off quite a bit of the paint, including the black paint as well, just so that I could get more variation in colour, I guess, and also to let some of that white plaster shine through. Once that had dried, I coated everything with a thick layer of Mod Podge. I then turned my attention to the cobblestone. So to get these tones, I mixed together variations of Payne's grey and natural grey, and I mixed those with some creams just to give me some different colours on these stones. Once that had dried, I gave everything a heavy dry brushing, followed by a black wash. For the black wash, I'm using black acrylic paint and isopropyl alcohol. Once that had dried, which didn't take very long at all because of the IPA, I then gave it a thick coat of Mod Podge. And the reason for adding the Mod Podge is so that we can protect that surface for when we add the grout. For the roof, I mixed together some watered down Mod Podge with some black acrylic paint, and I gave this 3 thin layers. After those layers had dried, I went in and gave it a really heavy dry brushing. Well, probably not a dry brush to be honest, but a good coating of the light grey. I then went in and gave certain areas a lighter highlight as well. Everything which you have seen me paint here today, I did in one afternoon. That was a pretty tiring day. For the mortar, I'm using some cheap polyfiller which I got at the pound shop, and I mixed in some cream coloured paint that I painted the top half of the building with earlier on. When it comes to the application, I was just using my finger just to smush it in all of those cracks in between the bricks and with the cobblestones as well. I would then wipe everything away with baby wipes and with kitchen paper. Now I'm adding some age to these bricks. So for me to achieve that, I'm using some watered down black acrylic paint, and I'm just adding it in all of the corners and all of the areas where mold and damp and that type of thing would normally grow and accumulate. My aim here is to give this, one, to age it, but to make it feel like maybe this could be like the side of an alley or something like that. Once I had applied the paint, I'm just using the dirty water from my paintbrush jar, and then to blend everything in, I'm using a wet baby wipe, and then I'm sopping up a lot of the excess water with paper towels. Moving on to the steps. So first of all, I folded over a piece of copy paper and I just drew a random step kind of shape. I then transferred that over to a piece of balsa wood. Now this balsa wood was actually really quite dense and thick, so I did have to use a jeweler's saw for me to cut through this wood. Next, I used that same template to create my second step, except this time I cut the paper from behind just to shorten that a little bit. This piece of wood was much softer than the bottom step, so I was able to use my craft knife to cut through that. Next, I used my emery board so that I could soften off my edges and give this a much smoother transition. I want the step to have a stone or a concrete kind of feel, something along those lines, but either way I do want a lot of texture, so I mixed together some Mod Podge with some grey paint and quite a bit of sand in there as well. Now I did make sure to use a paintbrush that I don't really care about, because when you are painting with sand or these coarse things in these mixtures, it does ruin your brushes. So if you do this, do make sure to use an old brush. I gave everything a heavy coat of that mixture, and then I also sprinkled on some extra sand onto the top of the step just so that it would give me more texture when I come to do the dry brushing. I then allowed everything to dry thoroughly, and then I gave it a heavy black wash. Once that black wash had dried, I then went in with a very light grey colour to highlight that sand texture. When the door of this house is open, I feel like the step could be a little bit of a weak spot if it was to be knocked. So instead of using toothpicks, I'm actually using a micro brush, as the plastic from these are really sturdy, and then I can just slot that into the holes which you see me drill previously. So moving on to the drawer handle itself, I did actually go ahead and purchase this Harry Potter wand from Amazon. The wand itself is really good quality, it looks really cool, and it would look cool as a handle just by itself. However, I did want to disguise this as being a Harry Potter wand. My project is magical themed, and there's going to be wizards and a magic shop and all of that, but I don't want it to be Harry Potter, so I am going to change the look of this a little bit. So to do that, I am using epoxy sculpt, and I'm just winding that around that wand, one to strengthen it, because my wand did come with a crack in it, which I did try to fill with epoxy sculpt first of all, and I'm just want it to look like a really rough and rugged piece of wood which is being used as a wand. I also really like these knots which it has in the handles, so I'm adding some more of those, again just using the epoxy sculpt. Epoxy sculpt does stick to most things really well, and now that everything is cured, this wand is really heavy and sturdy. For me to disguise that this is just a piece of clay attached to some plastic, I do go in and try and follow the lines which are already sculpted into the wand already, and then I'm using a wire brush and dragging that through just to give this winding pieces of clay a little bit more of a wooden texture. To attach my wand to the drawer, I am using these bolts which I picked up at B&Q. I then built the epoxy sculpt around the nut end of it, and then I tried to replicate those knots and so on that we have in the wood and copied that texture just so that it would make the bolt invisible when it is attached. I then allowed that to cure, and then I took it outside and I gave it a coat of this Army Painter black primer. To paint the wand, I'm using some bog standard acrylic paints, and I started off with a dark brown first of all as my base colour. I'm not working the paint into the texture of the wood either. I want that to stay dark. I did give everything a coat of that base colour first, just so that we could hide the black paint underneath. I then gradually started working my way up through the lighter colours in more of a dry brushing sense, so that I could keep all of that texture visible. And then I started to highlight the winding wood that goes around the main wand itself. For this part of the wand, I did like the shape of that, so I thought I would try and highlight that a little bit more. So I went with a reddier colour, or a more red colour, and then I started moving on to the dry brushing. For the dry brushing, I did go in really quite heavy because I am going to give the entire wand a wash in a moment. So I did want to give as many highlights as possible because the speed paint which I use is quite a dark colour. I'm using this speed paint because it is liquid enough for it to seep into all of those details, but it's also translucent, so it highlights all of the highlights, but it makes everything look unified as well. Once that speed paint had dried, I took it outside and I gave it a coat of this semi-gloss varnish. I absolutely love how the wand is looking. It is looking deep, it's looking rich, but it does need something else. So for a little bit of contrast and to be in keeping with the house eventually, because I will be adding loads of foliage and mosses and things like that on the outside as well as on the inside of the shop, I decided to add a little bit of moss to my wand as well. That also in turn hides my pretty bad sculpting and blending with that epoxy sculpt, but that's not a bad thing. I absolutely love how this moss is on the outside. So to glue it all down, I just used that stencil glue from before, and I also added some moss onto my step as well. And that brings us to the end of this video. So if you yourself are in the market for a laser cutting machine, then do go check out the description box below. I've left a link there where AlgoLaser are offering you a very special discount on the DIY kit Mark II laser cutting machine. So as always guys, thank you for spending your time with me today. I hope that you are having a fantastic day, and I shall see you very soon. Bye.